This is how it works. When the Air Force decides to decommission a missile, first it pulls the missile out of the ground and takes it someplace else, like maybe to a missile field in Montana. Then the Air Force hires a demolition company to blow up the silo. The demolition contractor first salvages as much stuff as he can, wires and huge heaps of steel, and anything else he can get a buck for. Then he sticks a bunch of explosives into the silo and blows the thing to smithereens. Maybe a week later, the contractor brings in bulldozers and they plow out something called a cone of depression. Basically, it's a giant crater that lays open the demolished silo to Russian spy satellites so they can snap photos of it and confirm that the silo has, in fact, been destroyed. After a few months, the bulldozers come back and fill in the hole, and then the missile silo just becomes a wheat field again. One weekend, I stay out at Larry Lang's place near Devil's Lake. Larry was active in the North Dakota Peace Coalition in the 80s, and he came up with this idea to plant evergreen trees at the missile silos. He takes me out to Silo E46 north of town. The activists call this one the Peace School missile because back in 1986, they gathered here and pitched tents and conducted classes on nuclear weapons. Larry planted a tree here, and it's still standing. It's shaped a little funny because someone lopped the top off a few years back around Christmas time. As it turns out, the peace activists had all sorts of ideas for drawing attention to the silos. They talked about planting trees and peace poles and erecting giant stone markers carved with biblical verses. The Air Force never tried to hide the silos, but they hoped the things would be invisible all the same. They hoped people would get used to them and ignore them, and the only complaints would come from farmers like the guy I read about who objected to the silo on his farm because it cost him 32 extra minutes when he plowed, what with all the extra twists and turns he had to make to avoid the thing. Anyway, it turned out the Air Force was right. The silos blended into the landscape, camouflaged behind their ordinariness. The only thing that was weird or out of the ordinary were these peace activists who kept making such a big deal out of them.
He's down to no players, over.
A demolition company out of Minnesota got the contract to blow up the silos in the Grand Forks missile field. 150 silos scattered throughout the eastern half of the state that were being decommissioned thanks to the SALT II treaty. I kept passing the contractors' green pickup trucks on the back roads and seeing guys in green hard hats loitering out in the wheat fields. Thanks to a tip from the press officer at the Air Force Base, I got to attend one of the demolitions. Out at the site, I meet a kid from Texas who's in his early 20s and whose job is to strap a rope around his belly and rappel down into the silo hole and plant explosive charges down there. I talk to him as he's unspooling fuse wire down the dirt road that leads to the silo, and I ask him how it feels to be a part of history. He smiles and he shrugs because it's not history, it's just a job. After the implosion, the Air Force press officer lets me take some shots of the silo. She points out the huge chunks of concrete and steel rebar that have been blasted out of the hole, and she says that the debris is proof that the missiles had always been meant for defensive purposes only. Otherwise, why would the silos have been so heavily fortified? I try to follow her logic, but I don't know. I mean, I'd grown up just like everyone else, worrying about nuclear war and mutually assured destruction, and listening to kids my own age say they didn't expect to live beyond the age of 20 or 30. And I'd always imagine these missiles up in North Dakota steaming and sputtering underground, pushing at their silo lids, malevolent and almost alive. But now, here I am in North Dakota, and they tell me it's just as easy to remove a missile from its silo as it is to put it in. And they tell me that the silos themselves had just been like any other federal construction project, built by the lowest bidder, and in the end, blown up by the lowest bidder, too. When you pull into a little farm town in North Dakota, check out the churches first. Usually there are two of them, the one that was built first and the second one that was started by the people who got sick of the first one. If the churches are Lutheran, and they're almost always Lutheran, it's a good bet the town was founded by Scandinavians, and most of them were probably Norwegians. If the churches are Catholic, then the town was settled by Germans. Sometimes I'd come across a Baptist church, and I didn't know what to make of that. In the really small towns, there's just a post office and a bar, and all the town's business is conducted in the one place or the other. The post office is where you go for news from the outside world, and when crop prices are down, I'm told it's mostly bad news. Credit card bills and bank statements and glossy mailers from your congressman with assurances that he's fighting for you up on Capitol Hill. The garbage barrel at the post office in these little towns is full of trash like that. Letters torn in two and cast away like a losing lottery ticket. The bar is where you go next, to forget about the post office, or to hide out from all those letters piling up in your P.O. box. Urgent letters trying to track you down. Final notices and final notices, with zip codes that go from 5 digits to 5 digits plus 4, as the letters try to zero in on you with surgical precision. I meet a guy in Minot who teaches at the local college. He explains that the way an agricultural economy works is that the marginal land goes out of production first, and that North Dakota is a whole state of marginal land. That's why back in the 80s, when things really began to look grim, some academic types suggested that the state turn itself into a vast reserve for buffalo, a kind of national nature preserve they proposed to call the Buffalo Commons. The idea bugged a lot of North Dakotans. After all, who wants their home state to turn into a game park?
There's legislation in Congress to make one of the control centers in South Dakota into the Cold War Missile Museum.
Right.
But one of our concerns, or a meeting of peace activists, is how is that thing going to be presented? Right. It was extremely important. It was no minor matter. Is this going to be a place that gives people the impression that the weapon was a good thing and that it kept the peace, rather than that this was a highly dangerous weapon of mass destruction, and it's important that it's gone now and that we're working for the abolition of all these things in the future? How do you articulate? So a person working with the Park Service who was lobbying for this attended the State Historical Society's annual historical conference in Bismarck, and she had a workshop just on this, drumming up support. So there I was, in my usual role, to have to ruin the party, and it takes a certain amount of gall to always have to do that. And it was interesting how frustrating that event became for me. I found that rather depressing. I was getting very anxious during this presentation because I was realizing I was starting to feel more like an idiot, like this is hopeless. Like everything I've ever done, what's the use? I could just feel it. I mean, the forces of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex are so powerful. They're so big. they're so rich, they have so much money, they are so deeply rooted in people. I mean, what am I doing? But I did, I turned it into a ceremony event, and I could tell that, it affected the people that were there, of course, because I said, I made this paper crane. I noticed that the missile site that you are thinking of making into a command control center was named by our people the Cassandra missile. I looked in there, which is a woman in Greek mythology who was a prophet and warned of the destruction of Troy, but the gods had put this curse on her that no one would ever believe her. That was a significant thing. I'll never forget that when I said to the group and to her that it was named the Cassandra missile, it was funny how I thought her face kind of blanched, because I don't know if she knew who Cassandra was, but I had a sense that what was going through her mind was sort of like, there's a whole world of this that I don't know anything about. And she was this nice person who works with the National Park Service, but if you are going to do anything relating to weapons of mass destruction, whether biological or chemical or nuclear, I guess my message is, it should tear you apart. It should make you crazy a little bit.
Back in the 80s, an activist group called Nuke Watch had the idea to map the location of all the ICBMs in the US. So with the help of volunteers, they visited every silo in every state that has them: Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Nebraska, Missouri, and the Dakotas. In place of the Air Force designation for the silos, the activists came up with their own names, like Kissinger's Remorse, Megadeth, Easy Come, Easy Go. Brian Polachek, a member of the North Dakota Peace Coalition, took me out to Silo D4, midway between Bismarck and Minot. Brian named this missile Bloodlefilth, a word he borrowed from James Joyce. Unlike the missiles in the eastern part of the state, the missiles around Minot are still in the ground. So even though Brian had lots of interesting stuff to say about North Dakota history and the history of peace activism, I had trouble paying attention, what with this fully armed nuclear bomb just over his shoulder. This is Flight Control Center I, back there. And the Flight Control Center I was responsible for 10 ICBMs that are scattered all around this part of North Dakota, close to Langdon. Now it's abandoned. This is where the guys would actually hang out in the silos deep underground. This is where they would launch the nuclear missiles from. This is the place where nuclear war would begin, right over there. In Minot, I visit a Scandinavian heritage park that's dedicated to the various Scandinavians who were the first settlers in North Dakota. There's a reconstructed Viking boat and a traditional sauna bath from Finland, and this eternal flame in memory of a Norwegian guy named Sondre Norheim, the father of modern-day skiing. Standing next to a little man-made waterfall is a statue of Leif Erikson. A plaque says the statue is dedicated to our Icelandic ancestors whose diligence and high moral standards have been an inspiration to those who followed. The day I visit, the statue is surrounded by police tape. As I'm leaving Minot, the census numbers come out, the gist of which is that everybody has suddenly and inexplicably decided to move to Las Vegas. For North Dakota, however, the numbers don't look so good. Of the state's 53 counties, 47 lost population, and a good chunk of those counties reported 6 people or less per square mile. By the standards of the 19th century Census Bureau, that qualifies them as frontier land again. When those original Scandinavian homesteaders closed the frontier, no one figured it would ever open up again. That's not what was supposed to happen. That's not how things were supposed to turn out. At first, it bugged me that no one except a handful of peaceniks even seemed to care that the nuclear missile silos were getting blown up. But the more I ask around, the more I begin to figure out that people aren't really indifferent. They just honestly never believed these missiles would be launched. That's when I begin to get a sense of the crazy logic of nuclear deterrence that said the more bombs you had, the less chance you'd ever need to use any of them. It all struck me as less like a national defense policy than as a really bad piece of performance art. The peace activists had their own kind of performance art. I read that back in 1984, some activists stormed a ICBM silo in Missouri with a jackhammer and began jackhammering the concrete lid of the silo. The activists also splattered human blood on the silo, which was like some kind of nuclear missile voodoo ritual. I guess they figured the best chance they had of getting rid of these missiles wasn't with an arms treaty, but with black magic. Bismarck is one of those state capitals I could never remember in grade school. The Missouri River flows along the city's western edge, and if you want it to, you could wade into the water and float all the way to St. Louis, and from there you could catch a ride on the Mississippi down to New Orleans and the sea. The town of Mandan sits across the river from Bismarck, another twin city in a part of the country where the cities come in pairs: Fargo-Moorhead, Grand Forks, East Grand Forks, Bismarck, Mandan. As if the thought of spending the winter alone on these northern plains is too much for a city to bear, so the cities come in twos. Mandan bills itself as the town where the West begins, the first cowboy town after all those farm towns out east. But to me, Mandan feels more like the town where the prairie ends, a place to say one last Lutheran prayer and to drink one last grain belt beer before drifting west toward misfortune and Montana. There's an abandoned anti-missile base at Nakoma that's legendary among North Dakotans. It took years to build and hundreds of millions of dollars, and it involved all sorts of cutting-edge technology. But in 1976, just 2 days after it was declared fully operational, the government cut its funding, and the military had to shut the place down. There's still this enormous cement pyramid out there, sitting in the middle of a field like the tomb of some wheat farmer pharaoh. One day, when I heard that a crop circle had suddenly appeared on a nearby farm, I wasn't too surprised. I mean, everyone knows that UFOs are attracted to pyramids like flies to butter. And anyway, the crop circle and the pyramid have a lot in common. No one can say what they mean, or why they're there, or what sinister plot or hidden agenda they're part of. Some people think space aliens are behind all this, while other people say it's just a big con job. Is this, have you lived in Lansford your whole life? Did you
Yep,
grow
I've
up?
lived up there for 80 years. Same place. I build the buildings and then I paint them before I put the windows and doors in.
Right.
And I paint the windows and doors, they're all different color. I'd like to make gravel roads and I got some grass that You can spread glue down and sprinkle the stuff on, and it stands up. I thought, gee, that's a joke. I sent for some just to find out what it was like. By golly, it works. This is the only building left on Main Street now, and that's been added to and designed, redesigned, and guy living in it now. That's the only one left on Main Street. The rest are burnt up, and they just tore the others. Well, they had a dance hall, and they tore it all down. It was condemned, so they. That hotel I never seen. I never seen it. I got the church, but I had hotel. That burnt down too. That and the bowling alley. Figure on getting lights in them someday. I don't know whether we will or not. Kids want me to put lights in them. So I said, well, if you want lights in them, you got to help me. I'm not doing it by myself.